Hello, and welcome to Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate. Here's our host, Cherish Budzinski.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Exploring Intersections. This program is made possible through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, Region 10. Throughout this year, we're talking with expert panelists about some of the biggest social issues of our time. If you've missed our past programs, you can watch them on YouTube or download a podcast version. Today, our panel conversation centers on food security. Food security means having access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food at all times to meet the dietary needs for a productive and healthy life. It seems so simple in concept, yet so out of reach in reality. As someone who has experienced food insecurity during several phases of my life, this topic is especially personal. I remember the shame at the checkout counter as my family used food stamps. As a college student working unpaid internships, I survived on popcorn for days. Free school breakfasts and lunches and government cheese and neighbors dropping off boxes of food at the holidays helped my family survive poverty. I can only imagine how much harder it is to overcome these challenges when facing our intersectional issues of racism, migration, and climate change. My story is anything but unique, and our experts know this all too well. So let's meet them. Sister Rochelle Friedman is a member of the Sisters of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She is Director of Public Policy for the Coalition on Human Needs in Washington, D.C., an alliance of national organizations working together to promote public policies that address the needs of low-income and other vulnerable populations. Sister Rochelle has more than 30 years of legislative experience on a wide range of issues that include food, healthcare, housing, labor, immigration, taxes, and the federal budget. Welcome, Sister Rochelle.
Thank you, Cherish. I'm delighted to be here with you and your listeners.
Jamie Doherty is an educator and dietitian. After realizing that she didn't know anything about food, which was discouraging when meeting with patients and clients, she went back to school to study culinary arts. Her master's dissertation centered on the experiences of students with food insecurity and campus food pantries. Currently, she is an assistant professor at Fontbonne University in St. Louis, where she developed an on-campus food pantry. Welcome, Jamie.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
And our third panelist, Ashley Bailey, was unable to join us today. So let's first of all start by talking about food security and food insecurity. We often hear that term, food insecurity. What exactly does that mean, and how many in our country suffer from food insecurity? Sister Rochelle, let's start with you.
Well, I think the slide that was up earlier did a good job of defining food insecurity. It means being without reliable access to sufficient quantity, affordable, nutritious food. And when we talk about nutritious, I think that's really key, because sometimes people that can't afford it maybe have enough food to fill their stomachs, but it's not nutritious. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture's last household food insecurity report, which was for 2020, said that more than 38 million people in the United States experienced hunger in 2020. That's about 12% of the population. And we know that households with children and Black and brown households are more likely to experience food insecurity.
That's a comprehensive answer. Anything to add to that, Jamie?
You know, I think in doing my research and exploring that definition that Rochelle did a great job on, is there's different levels within the food insecure and the food secure realm. So you can be very low, and you can also be low food insecure. And I think that piece with the hunger really points out, one denotes hunger, which obviously is very different for everyone, and the other does not. And I think that becomes that key issue between, are we providing adequate nutritious food that's actually going to satisfy individuals that do fit into a food insecure definition.
Thank you for helping us understand that better. What inspired the two of you to become active in food security issues? Jamie, let's stay with you for a minute.
Yeah, so a few years back, worked at a different university, and I had an interaction with a student that was hungry. As dietitians, we do a lot of different assignments in our classes and in real life with clients that allow us to understand the food that individuals are taking in on a daily basis. So for this particular student, we were doing 24-hour recalls. And his recall basically, looked like he was having about 200 calories a day for the past few days. So of course, as a dietitian, I questioned that and realized that he was hungry. He was homeless, he was hungry, and he didn't know where he was going to be getting his next meal from. So the carrots that he had noted on his food recall and the crackers were the only food still available to him until he was able to, get paid for the job that he worked at the end of the week. And so that started to inspire me to think, here's a realm of food and nutrition that I haven't even stepped into. And I'm interacting with individuals that clearly fit into a food insecure definition at that time. I, wasn't as privy to what all the nooks and crannies of that were. And it really started this trip down understanding, especially college students, because that's the audience that I particularly work with right now, what they're struggling with, what I can do to help, and what resources are out there. So that was kind of the inspiration back in almost 6 years ago to kind of get started on this path.
Amazing. And Sister Rochelle, what got you started in working on food security issues?
Well, I remember growing up on a farm, and when we were on the farm, my mom had a big garden and we had our own meat. So we always had enough to eat. And one of the situations that struck me, I was teaching in Iowa at the time, and on Saturdays, I did a little bit of volunteer work. The bakery in town would bring the bread that had timed out, if you would, on the shelf to a place where people could pick up bread. And I was so struck. It was one kind of fall winter day. It was very cold and it was rainy. And people lined up outside. The bread hadn't arrived yet, but some of them came an hour early, waiting to get maybe 2 loaves of bread. And if they were lucky, maybe a package of rolls. And then I remember some of them would stay around to see, maybe after everybody got a couple loaves of bread, if there was any left over so they could get a 3rd loaf. And it just struck me that the degree to which people would go just so they could have bread. So then when I came to the Coalition on Human Needs, and we cover the gamut of human needs, I have always believed that food and shelter are basic human rights. So I was very pleased that one of the issues that we work on at the Coalition on Human Needs is food and food security.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. These days, who's suffering from food insecurity in our country? And why do you think that's so? Sister Rochelle, you mentioned families of color are often taking on a little more of this.
Well, at the basic heart of who's suffering from food insecurity is poverty. So we look at who in our country are the poorest, and disproportionately families of color are poor. We often see a lot of hunger and food insecurity on places like reservations. And then throughout the country, we have a lot of food deserts. They might be rural, they might be urban. Places where there are not big box grocery stores, there might be very expensive little corners on the stores on the corner where people go to get food. So it's throughout the country. It's very pervasive, which I think is incredibly troublesome given how much food we produce in this country. There's enough food to go around, but it's just not accessible and affordable to everyone.
Good points. Jamie, anything to add to that about who you're seeing who is suffering from food insecurity?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm in a university setting, so I'm seeing college students, but we can't just put them into that one identifier. So within that realm, really there's a lot of non-traditional students that fit into working several jobs, have dependents, potentially single parents. So I think those fit into some of the groups that, you know, Sister Rochelle was speaking to too. Another thing that I find is interesting in some of my research is this piece about we have so much food, it's just the access and the affordability. So often there are farmers that actually fit into that group too, where depending on, of course, the climate and what they're able to procure and harvest, they too could potentially fit into a food insecure definition in any given growing year.
I'm so glad that you brought that up too, because I think a lot of people, when they think of college students and food insecurity, they don't think about the fact that many are supporting a family at the same time. Yeah, very important. So in your experience, how does food security play a role in our intersectional issues of racism, migration, and climate? Jamie, you mentioned climate initially. Any thoughts on racism, migration, and climate and how they feed into that?
Yeah, I think the piece with regards to, they all do intersect in many different ways, especially when it comes to food. So if we think about a variety of different ethnic groups who may be migrating here, and they're coming here obviously with, you know, the clothes on their back and maybe a bag of essentials. And so they fit into that piece of not knowing where to have resources or access to basic needs. So food fits into that. Also transportation, housing. And so there's that piece with ethnic groups. You can't not look at this and say that, as Sister Rochelle mentioned, that African Americans can fit into this as well, because they often are found to have limited access or live in areas more so that may not have, that may be a food desert. And so those two groups of individuals start to overlay itself with regards to having the access and having the resources that allow them to have the nutritious foods at their plate. The climate change piece, you know, adds a whole nother layer when we think about, you know, weather concerns that have started to change even in the recent years, past 5 years, that lead to less food production at times for obviously farmers, which are then feeding individuals in their area or providing foods for grocery stores or markets. And that decreased production then increases the food prices, which then becomes another double whammy for some of these groups that can't afford food, plus food prices are increasing. And it also leads to farmers having to change their production methods, which can take time and resources, leading to even less food that's harvested or procured, depending on obviously what's happening in certain areas of the world, of the US in particular. So all of these factors do lead to, you know, this kind of perfect intersection. It's very imperfect, but an intersection that definitely impacts the access that individuals living in the US in particular are able to get the food they need.
Well said. Sister Rochelle, in your experience, how do these issues intersect? Racism, migration, and climate, and food insecurity.
Well, Jamie mentioned migration, and one of the issues that I work on at the Coalition on Human Needs is immigration. And one of the things that was true and has been true for a number of years, a lot of the immigrants coming to our southern border from Central America are Guatemalan. And we know that in Guatemala, there has been a multi-year drought. And so there's not enough food. Guatemala has the highest number of malnourished in Central America. So we saw disproportionately the last number of years people coming from Guatemala. And then most recently, my heart really aches because of the situation of Haitians. We know that due to natural disasters, maybe 10 years ago, many Haitians migrated to South America, and some of them are coming up now because of the political unrest and other things happening there. So sadly, there have been a lot of Haitians at our border. We know that we saw the pictures within the last month of the Haitian refugees in Mexico. And I'm very sad that our country has sent many of them back to Haiti, a country where they may not have lived for over 10 years. And Haiti has one of the highest levels of food insecurity in the world. Nearly half of the population are in need of food and cannot access it. And something like, I read a statistic lately, like 1.2 million people in Haiti suffer from hunger. So we know that there have been natural disasters, climate is relevant, and then of course political unrest as well. But worldwide, there are other places similar to, but maybe not as desperate as Haiti, although I know some of the countries in Africa also have a lot of food insecurity and hunger.
These are such complex issues. And I know, Jamie, you did mention food deserts, which is a really important issue, and we could spend an hour on that by itself. But are there other ways that our food systems in the US feed into those intersectional issues as well? Either one of you can feel free to answer if you have thoughts.
I guess I was thinking of the recent, for example, fires in California, and California is a heavy agriculture state. And so that has been disruptive of, I think, some of the food supplies. And when I think of migration and immigration and food, I think a couple years back when the state of Georgia decided it was going to have very stringent laws about immigrants. And what happened is, as a result, immigrants fled Georgia, and an entire peach crop rotted on the trees because there wasn't workers. So I think we really need to acknowledge the role that immigrants play in the food chain. And frankly, in Iowa, we know, Iowa, where I'm from, and where many of your listeners are from, we know, for example, that immigrants work in poultry factories. Immigrants throughout the Midwest and throughout the country really are a lot of those that pick crops, and they do it at very, very low, unacceptable wages. So there is a huge intersection, I think, of migration, immigration, food, and then of course, climate. We see, for example, I was talking to a friend in North Dakota. North Dakota's crop this year is quite devastated. So that means that some of the farmers are having to slaughter their livestock because there's nothing to feed them. So it is a very broad, pervasive kind of an issue. And I think I would just say lastly, we've been hearing on the news the last number of weeks how there's a shortage of truckers in our country, and a lot of food is delivered through trucks. So in my grocery store here in Washington, where I work and live, there are many areas on shelves that do not have the food that they normally do.
I think you bring up so many important points, Sister Rochelle. One that's most stunning to me is that the apple that I eat may have been picked by somebody who's going without. And I think that that's something that I'll take away with me after this conversation here, and just have that mindfulness when we when we enjoy our food, right? Jamie, anything to add to that about specifically the food systems and how they feed into those intersectional issues?
Yeah, I think Sister Rochelle did a great job because we have to think about the food getting to our plate. So clearly there's a lot of food systems within that. And when we think about the transportation of the food and that being taking longer and not having individuals being able to provide that, and or individuals on the land helping to harvest that, it just goes right back to that economic piece, which is driving up the food prices, which is exactly the opposite of what we want in order to allow individuals to have access to what they need. And when that's the case, we then have to reach these individuals with resources to be able to provide them with an adequate supply. I also agree with the piece of not even having, I live in St. Louis and the same as in Washington. There's many grocery stores that are not stocked. And this is for individuals who do have access to it. And so you can only imagine then what's happening in some of these neighborhoods or food deserts that aren't even able to get food brought to them. As we kind of enter into, the winter season as well too. So it's interesting to look at how, again, there's this intersection, this interplay of how one piece impacts the other piece, which impacts the other. It's almost like a domino effect. That you're right, until you're, a little more mindful about it and thinking a little bit more about how you may be impacted or how you could potentially help someone that's impacted. You don't think about how all these things play themselves out.
Could I just add, Cherish, I just want to give a shout out to people who work at food banks and local food distribution centers that may not be tightly connected with a food bank. I have a good friend that volunteers in Pennsylvania at a food bank every day where they provide food and clothing to needy families. And I think that there are so many people that really understand how basic food is and who are willing to volunteer. And so many people also donate both money and food to food banks and to food distribution centers.
And that is a perfect segue. Jamie, I know I haven't really given you a chance to talk about the food pantry, but tell us about the work that you're doing and how you're supported.
Yeah, so at Friedman University, we received a lovely grant from a wonderful group of women. The Friedman Community Connection is a giving circle here at our university where women provide funding, usually seed money, to kind of get some projects off the ground on a yearly basis. So as faculty, we then apply for these grants internally as opportunities to support the curriculum that we're doing in the classroom, and as well as some more of our larger passion projects. So back in 2018, I did a needs assessment on our campus with a group of students, identified that there were individuals that were food insecure that could benefit from using the campus food pantry, which is now called the Griffin Market. And the first thing I thought of was, I'm going to apply for a grant because these women are very supportive. And I think this is a great idea that's going to benefit not only the students in my classes and in the dietetics program, because they're able to work in that space and help to get it off the ground, but the larger campus community. And so in November of 2018, we kind of had a soft opening and then officially opened in spring of 2019. So we've been open now for almost 3 years. And the money that we received from that Friedman Community Connection really kind of got the ball rolling.
I think that it's such amazing work, and it's life-changing work really for people who are having a hard time making ends meet and getting nutritious food on the table. It's amazing. Sister Rochelle, there are a number of federal food assistance programs, I know, and you, as someone who's closely connected at the federal level, have deep information about this. Tell us about what these programs are and who they benefit.
Okay, so there are a lot of food programs that are federally funded, and I'll just name some of the kind of major big ones that people are aware of. First is the SNAP program. SNAP is an acronym for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or as you referred to it when you were growing up, Cherish, the food stamp program. So this helps low-income individuals and families by providing monthly benefits to them. And in order to be eligible, a family income must be less than 130% of poverty. So for a family of 3, that's about $28,500. Another program is called WIC, Women, Infants, and Children. So that program services pregnant, postpartum, breastfeeding women, infants, and children up to age 5 who are at risk of not having the right kind of food to eat. And again, there's an income eligibility threshold. It's higher than for SNAP. It's actually 185% of poverty. So this same family of 3 is eligible if they make less than $40,000. Another program that we hear or probably is familiar to us is Meals on Wheels. It delivers food to people who are homebound and unable to prepare or purchase their food. It's not always called Meals on Wheels, but it's different things in different areas. And then there are a number of programs that benefit school-age children. So there's a school lunch program where low cost and free lunches are available to children whose families do not have sufficient income. There's a school breakfast program, which reimburses states to operate breakfast programs in schools and residential child care centers. And there's the summer food program. What we know is during the year when children are getting nutritional programs, or meals, both often maybe breakfast and lunch. In the summer when that's not available, children really suffer because of that. So that program started out with some pilot states and has been expanded to more and more states. And it's again a program that provides meals and snacks to children. There's also the child and adult food care program. Again, what this does is it provides reimbursements for nutritious meals and snacks that are served to children and adults who are in child care and adult daycare centers. So those are a few of the federal programs that try to address the food needs of individuals.
Amazing. And Jamie, are there any particular programs that specifically look at the needs of college students that you know of? I know I'm kind of throwing that out there.
The SNAP program that Sister Rochelle just spoke of, at least here in Missouri, there was new eligibilities that I just got from my contact over at the St. Louis area food bank. And so what we are going to be doing here is being retrained as educators and staff to then help our students who are eligible for SNAP or who may not even know they're eligible for SNAP do the application process and start it here on campus. And then now we have a liaison at the St. Louis area food bank that kind of gets that finished for them and is kind of their, gatekeeper, because it can be daunting. Obviously with any thing regarded to food insecurity, there's stigma around it. So, even last week I had a student approach me after class. How difficult was that for her to do? And she's not even a student in my program. So I just met her 6 weeks ago and she asked me if I could help her with SNAP benefits and if she was eligible. And so I love that we have a fairly small campus that we can provide that, but many universities across the US are doing that too, providing that additional benefit, because as I'll talk about here in a little bit, a food pantry, a Griffin market can only go so far.
Absolutely. I wish that there were something we could do to eliminate the stigma around this issue too, but even when I was experiencing food insecurity myself, I didn't talk to anyone about it. I mean, that would have been horrifying, right? So I think that we have made some big strides in that direction, but there's still work to be done for sure.
Mhm.
Jamie, the image of that starving college student is so common. It's actually cliche, and it seems accepted as a given that students will be too poor to afford the food that they need. Just how prevalent is food insecurity among college students? And why is it important to change that perception that this is normal?
Yeah, I think, within the last 10 years, there's been a lot of prevalence data. And so when I first started my research, there was probably anywhere between 8 to 10 different research articles that looked at data from four-year colleges and universities all the way to community colleges. So the range is somewhere between 20 to 50%, depending on the institution. Obviously, community colleges often have a higher prevalence due to students being commuter students and often potentially being in a lower income bracket. So we start with the prevalence data, but then it does go into that piece on what do you do with the prevalence data? And so that's kind of where I came in with my research. I wanted to understand, what was really going on with these students. If they are getting food from campus food pantries, or they have a variety of other programs at different universities and colleges. One, for example, is Swipe Out Hunger, where if I am a student who has X amount of meals on a pass for the dining hall, a meal card, I can always give my meal card passes away to students who may need them and don't have a meal plan. So there's other things besides campus food pantries, but there is this image of a starving college student. And what is kind of a paradox about that is often if we think about things from more of a visual standpoint, they may appear that they're getting fed, that they're, from a weight standpoint, they may look like they're a healthier weight, but nourished. It's that nourished piece that, like Sister Rochelle mentioned a little bit ago, they technically can be malnourished, even though they look like they may be getting enough to eat. And so at many institutions across the US, there have within the last at least 10 years, the first campus food pantry was Michigan State University, I believe, in 1997. And once it was into 2007, it just became this, you could call it a reaction, but I also think it was a response to student affairs as well as faculty on campuses responding to students and saying, we need to do something about this. We'll start with campus food pantries. However, we also need to extend it beyond just what they're going to be able to receive on campus, because many campus food pantries can only provide X amount of items weekly to each of these students. So I think that's where it kind of ties in that SNAP benefit too. And there's a lot of student support services as well as resource management sources. Many campuses also have housing options that are of no to low cost. You see, even, and that's kind of goes beyond the food, but it goes back into that basic needs of saying, may have students that are even homeless for a couple weeks that need a place to stay. So I think there's been this great response from educators and leaders at universities to help those students get what they need. I see it from a campus food standpoint as another arm of student support services. You have financial aid, you have a writing center, you have accommodations, you have a campus food pantry that can help support the students while they're enrolled at the university or college.
I just like to pick up on one thing Jamie talked about, and that is some people look like they're not hungry. We know that we have a childhood obesity crisis in our country. And unfortunately, what happens, and it goes back to the quality of food, a lot of times the least expensive food is very high in carbohydrates. So you have people eating a lot of mac and cheese, if you would, or whatever. So someone can look like they're fine, but really they're malnourished and they're hungry for real food. Like fruits and vegetables, for example, tend to be more expensive.
Yeah, absolutely. And so often there are subsidies in place for highly processed foods, and it just sometimes doesn't trickle down to the more nutritious items that are available as well. So the global pandemic has impacted nearly every facet of our lives. And I imagine that it isn't any different when it comes to food insecurity. How has the pandemic affected food security issues? Sister Rochelle?
So just within the last couple of days, I was reading how worldwide hunger and poverty are rising rapidly in this COVID time. The number of people experiencing food insecurity is just skyrocketing up. The United Nations World Food Program operates in about 80 countries. And in those 80 countries, they estimate that 272 million people are already or at risk of becoming food insecure. And there's something else that's happening. It may seem like an aside to this discussion, but I just want to mention it here. So in the time of pandemic, what happens when COVID is raging, it really turns upside down an entire economy. And we saw that in our country, how many businesses closed and how many people were unemployed and so forth. So one of the things that I think troubles me and that I think we need to really press on is that 96% of people in low-income countries are not vaccinated. And even when the United States announces, at least initially when we announced, well, we're going to give 100,000 doses to this country or several million to that. Initially, our doses went predominantly, frankly, to wealthier countries. And one of the things that's happening now, Moderna is one of the companies that got $2.5 billion from the federal government to develop the vaccine. And so far, the vaccines that they've given have been mostly to wealthy countries. And they have been pressed, but so far have refused to share the vaccine technology with poorer countries. So as a result, we have COVID just rampant in so many of the particularly low-income countries. And it has such a dramatic impact on poverty, on employment, and on hunger and food insecurity.
And Jamie, are you seeing any particular effects on campuses that you'd like to note as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic?
When the pandemic started, obviously our university had to shut down. So we didn't have individuals coming to the campus food pantry, the Griffin Market. However, we did things that allowed us to still reach those students that needed it. So I had, gift cards that I already had available. So I could coordinate with students, and I worked with, this is where you start to see all these collaborations start to come together. I worked with our public safety to have those for the students when they needed them. So it wasn't even that I had to come to campus. I could be the kind of connector to this. We also allowed students, the public safety would open the food pantry more so as we got into the summer of 2020 and allow students access if they needed it. And again, we didn't have large numbers. We're talking maybe 5 students here, but they felt they could reach out and we could be a resource for them. So I felt like I was doing, some good. As we moved into the fall of 2020 and then all of last spring, we did start to see kind of a little uptick. We still had a lot of online classes, but we tried our best to kind of, put out some material as to when we would be open and if students, could still use the pantry, Griffin Market, sorry. And then as we've kind of gotten into the fall, we have seen a little surge. And what we're trying to do is say, what do you really need? We can get perishables, and we always did this, but the fresh fruits and vegetables, the dairy products, the whole grains, the, animal proteins, and really trying to be a little bit more open and a little more flexible with the items you can take weekly. Because we find the people who are using it really do need it right now. And often maybe they're feeding more than themselves, and that's fine. But it helps me think, those numbers that Sister Rochelle presented are definitely different than what we may have imagined it looked like for 2021 before the pandemic. But I do think there was a lot of good that came out of this. Individuals coming together. You often saw, unfortunately, long lines at some of these food banks and churches, but the fact that there were these resources to help neighbors in need, definitely goes to show the good that happened during this, not so great experience that we just had the last 18 months.
Yeah, absolutely. Sister Rochelle is someone who's active in the public policy realm at the national level. What recent and upcoming policies do you see affecting food security in this country? There's a lot going on.
There is a lot going on, and most of your listeners have probably heard either of the budget reconciliation bill or the president's Build Back Better plan. They're basically one and the same. And that's been the focus of much of my work for the last significant number of months. And the president's Build Back Better plan, which is now being considered in Congress, contains many positive provisions for low-income families. As it relates to child nutrition, if the plan were to be passed as it is now, we do have some concerns that the plan is going to be stripped down a little bit. But if it has what it is now, in terms of child nutrition, there would be an additional investment of $35 billion in child nutrition programs. The number of schools that would be able to offer free meals to all students would be expanded. Right now, there's a certain percentage. If the school reaches 30–40% of the children with free and reduced meals, they can make it available to everybody. So that would be expanded. Also, the summer food program. Students who receive free and reduced price school meals are all eligible for those programs. I always say that families that have one need often have multiple needs if they're low income and vulnerable. So those families that are at risk or indeed are food insecure tend also to have difficulty paying other expenses like housing and childcare and healthcare. So the Build Back Better plan contains more housing rental vouchers, help with childcare, and I think one of the most impactful provisions in Build Back Better is the expansion of the child tax credit. The child tax credit cuts poverty, it's estimated, by 40% at least. We already see what's happening because in March, the American Rescue Plan put a one-year expansion of the child tax credit in place. What it did is it increased the credit from $2,000 to $3,000 for children 6 through 17 and to $3,600 for children younger than 6. And instead of waiting until tax time next January, February, March to collect the child tax credit, it's being allocated on a monthly basis starting in July. We also know that for people who wonder, there is a phase out rate. Upper income families are not eligible. They continue to get the $2,000 credit, but they don't get $3,600 for their younger children or $3,000 for their 6 through 17s. I think one of the things that I'm very excited about my organization, Coalition on Human Needs, is going to be doing is we've hired a couple people to do extensive outreach because there is this thing, I think we talked earlier about if people are embarrassed to say they need help. And I know, again, a friend at the food pantry in Pennsylvania said, a lot of people said to her, this is the first time we've ever had to ask for help. So as a result, sometimes the uptake of these programs, which they're eligible for, aren't happening. So we're doing extensive outreach to make sure that families that are eligible for the child tax credit receive it. And one of the really, really great things about what happened in March, you used to have a certain amount of income to receive the credit. Now families that have no income receive the credit. And we know that there are people that need this that don't have an income. And going back to Jamie and your college students, many of them don't have an income because they're trying to get educated, but they have children, for example. We know that there are families that can't get affordable childcare, or we know that there are families where they're caring for an elderly parent and they're not working. So one of the things that we're pushing back really hard on now is a few members of Congress, one in particular by the name of Senator Manchin, is wanting there to be an income requirement to get the child tax credit. And we really, really think that that would be very problematic and harmful. So there's a lot of good things out there pending that are very exciting.
And as I'm hearing you talk, Sister Rochelle, and in preparing for this program, the thought that kept occurring to me over and over again is that hunger and food insecurity are policy choices. We have the power to change this. So
we absolutely do. We absolutely do. We're a very wealthy country. And it was just struck me yesterday, I was part of a Poor People's Campaign press conference. And what was brought home is billionaires in our country increased their wealth by $2 trillion the first year of the COVID pandemic, 2 trillion. And now some are pressing the 3.5 trillion Build Back Better program to be scaled back to maybe what billionaires made in the first year of the pandemic. So what we're saying is we don't really want to talk about 3.5 or 6. We don't want to talk numbers. We want to say, what are the needs of our people? And we know that we have the resources to meet those needs. So we need to really move forward with this.
it's time now to go to some of our audience questions. And we have one. This is really interesting. And I know both of you may not have the public health background to answer this, but let me know your thoughts. How does undernutrition contribute to the vulnerability of marginalized populations to COVID-19? Any thoughts on that?
I just as an opening piece, undernutrition in general makes it difficult for children to learn in school. It makes it difficult for adults to have the stamina to do their work. And so again, all of that is mixed in, I think, with what we talked about with COVID-19. All of these issues interact. So we have unemployment, we have food insecurity, which has been exacerbated during COVID-19. And I'm not sure I totally answered the question, but maybe there's other things to add.
Jamie, any thoughts?
Yeah. In particular to college students, in some of the research I've done, and this also goes to the K for 12, and even, adults that are in the working world, it's that performance piece, the academic performance, the work performance is impacted when we, a 1 day, 2 day undernourished isn't the end of the world, but we think about days, weeks, months, and that just goes right into the mental health piece. And so, there are so many layers there that can impact some of these individuals who are underrepresented or marginalized. And you add the layer of the COVID challenges on top of that. And now you see some of these individuals that are struggling even more so than they were, 18, 19 months ago.
Here's another audience question. What's available for middle-class working families struggling with putting healthy food on the table while working multiple jobs? It's a really good question.
Mm-hmm.
Are there programs out there that or support services for families who are struggling and are middle class?
I had mentioned the income criteria, and frankly, some of the income criteria, it depends on where you live and how middle class is defined, but some people that think of themselves as middle class are eligible for some of those programs. And then I think it goes back also to as Jamie is doing so beautifully in her university, programs that are set up by philanthropics or local programs, and certainly churches. Churches, I think, are aware of the issue of hunger among their congregations and their locales. So having regular meals, and some churches will say, you know, we used to serve 100 people on Tuesday night. Now we serve 300. And I know that often in centers that distribute food and clothing, people are not quizzed as to what their financial situation or their work situation is. I think there's an understanding of people that work there. We know people don't ask for help if they don't need it. And so there are places people can come that are middle class, supposedly middle class families. But even when you think about middle class family as they have, you know, a number of children, the resources just aren't there. And I was so touched when talking to someone who works at a food distribution center. She said, you know, people come and they're so grateful for what they receive, and they take only what they need. They don't take more because they know there are others that also need it. So I think that, again, what's done on that front is really wonderful. It's so necessary. And it also treats people with dignity so that they're not made to feel lesser or ashamed if they need to ask for help.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's another question from our audience. Do either of you have experience with community gardens and their benefits?
Yeah, we've done a few different collaborations, both here at the university, at Fontbonne, but at other universities that I'm with, where it's also it's another resource. It's another teachable moment where many of these community gardens will provide the seeds to grow the fresh fruits and vegetables often, that then individuals in the community can procure and harvest and add to whatever else they have in their food budget. I think there's a lot of things that go into building community and sharing food and doing some kind of labor, even if you have access to a variety of foods, understanding kind of how you spoke in the beginning about where your food comes from. So it's a great learning opportunity for K through 12. Many schools are integrating community gardens into the curriculum. And even here on our college campus, students having that opportunity just kind of get to experience that and see that as another option to decrease the cost of their food budget, you know, during trying times.
During our very first Nuns on the Bus trip in 2014, we happened to go to a place in Central Virginia where these two wonderful young men associated with a church, I think it was a Presbyterian church, they had acquired several acres of land and they were growing crops. And the real wonderful thing, it happened to be in a food desert. So they were providing food that a lot of people did not have access to. And then, as Jamie said, sometimes people could take plants and so forth and build themselves, build gardens themselves. And then the wonderful thing these guys were doing is they were teaching people how to process and cook and use the food. So it was very exciting. And I think there are lots of places throughout the country where similar kinds of things are happening, which I think is wonderful because, again, sometimes knowing how to cook is critical. I say that as somebody who's not a great cook. So
That's so true. Is there anything that the two of you might suggest that we as individuals can do to help alleviate the suffering related to food insecurity?
I think that advocacy is important. making sure that our resources are used on basic human needs. Coming from the Catholic perspective, we know that basically the gospel principle that's most significant is that we address the needs of people who are the poorest. And we believe, our church believes, that you can determine the justice of a country, of a nation, by how well it treats the poor among us. So I think we need to sometimes press our public officials. When I was working on the Farm Bill, which passed 4 years ago, there was a lot of pressure, again, on work requirements. If these people are going to get this benefit, they need to work. And we know that that's not always possible. So we need to, I think, bring the stories of people who need the benefit. There's nothing, somebody just said recently, the distance between two people is a story. So I think often to hear the stories of the people that are impacted is so critical. And it's critical for our elected officials, I think, to hear those stories.
I love that, the shortest distance between two people. Jamie, thoughts on what we can do as individuals?
Yeah, I mean, that tail end of what Sister Rochelle said was that understanding. I mean, that's what really started my, journey down this path of how I can help. And I just started to understand individual stories a little bit. I think in what we have here at our campus, it began as research understanding and turned into an actionable item, an application. My students saw, the hard work we did in a class for a needs assessment come to life. And those things don't happen quickly, and they're hard work, and the advocacy work is even harder than that sometimes and takes a long time. So it's getting passionate about how you can help those in your community and serve others, and stick with it.
Beautifully said. Thank you to everyone in our audience today who submitted questions for our panelists. And we're sorry, of course, we're not able to get to all of the questions, but we welcome you to continue the conversation on our Facebook page. So with a better understanding of food security and how it relates to our intersectional issues, it's time to talk about next steps. Each of our panelists have provided some suggested action items to help us as we move forward. Jamie, tell us about your action item.
So this is more specific to college students struggling with hunger, but this Hope for College is out of Temple University. And within the last 6 to 7 years was developed and can be a great resource just to learn a little bit more about what's going on with college students in particular, and also some of the legislative moves which would hopefully provide a variation of free and reduced lunch potentially at the university college level in the future.
Wonderful. Sister Rochelle, tell us about your action item.
Well, I feel a little bit passionate about the Build Back Better plan. And I think it's important for members of Congress to really get behind that and support it. So I encourage people to contact their members of Congress and ask them to support the Build Back Better plan. And I'm going to share a phone number. You can call your congressional senators and representatives at their state office. If you want to call them in DC, here's a phone number. It's 202-224-3121. That will get you to the Capitol switchboard. Ask them to connect you with their member of Congress, and then say, I desperately need you to vote in favor of the Build Back Better plan. Let me give you that number again. It's 202-224-3121.
Wonderful. Great action items. Thank you to both of you for providing those and providing your insights on food insecurity. But most of all, thank you for the important work that you're doing to help the people among us who are suffering.
Thank you, Cherish and Jamie.
Thank you.
And thank you also, and congratulations to the award-winning team of professionals who are working behind the scenes to bring this program to life every month. Next month on Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate, we explore restorative justice. Many thought leaders are advocating for a different approach in the criminal justice space. What if we pivoted in our approach to criminal justice and focused on offender rehabilitation and reconciliation with victims and communities? How might a deeper understanding of the root causes of crime drive this change? What does accountability and reintegration look like? As always, we'll lean on our panelists for thoughtful, nuanced conversation about this complex topic. That's November 10th at 3 p.m. Central Time. I hope you'll tune in. Thank you for being here today. This series is made possible through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, Region 10. Visit our website, exploringintersections.org, to find resources mentioned in today's conversation or to register to attend our next program. We broadcast live every second Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Central. You can also download podcasts of our panel discussions from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or via our website. And be sure to connect with us for the continuing conversation on Facebook. I'm Cherish Badzinski, and thanks for tuning in to Exploring Intersections.